And now it's my great honor and privilege to introduce one of our own, Kim Smetzer Ferrario. Kim's lived in Napa all her whole life. Fun fact, she's the daughter of Linda and Harlan Smetzer, and she's attended Crosswalk for about 5 years. Previously, she was raised as a child in church at First Christian Church on First Street and attended there most of her adult life. She started her career in education as a classroom teacher for Napa Valley Unified School District. Kim was inspired by a little girl in her class named Lydia, and many more like Lydia who spoke no English when she entered her classroom. She felt unequipped as a teacher, so she went to night school to learn Spanish and got a degree in, master's degree in language and literacy. Next, she received her reading specialist credential so she could work with students who were most in need of support in literacy and English as a second language. While she was reading specialist, she entered and completed PhD program at UC Davis in language, literacy, and culture. After 20 years at NVUSD, she left public school teaching and went into higher education. Currently, Kim is a full professor in the School of Education at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she has taught for 13 years. Essentially, she teaches teachers at the graduate level, particularly those who teach students learning English and other languages. She has taught remotely using Zoom and other technologies way before the pandemic. In fact, the School of Education at USC was the first university to have a synchronous online class in their graduate program, starting in 2009. Much of what she's sharing today is not from her professional life, but from her life experience as a mother, a seeker of spiritual growth, and an active member of Al-Anon for 14 years. I give you my friend, Kim.
Thank you, Ellie. That was super sweet.
Thank you for running.
Of course. Hello, am I on? Very good. Well, good morning, everyone. So happy to be here. Normally, I'm out there with you all, so this is a different perspective. I'm going to try to get into a little bit more shade. So I have a question for all of you. Has anyone here attended when this church was First Baptist Church? 50 years ago, perhaps? Anyone here attend? Ooh, I see some hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Anybody else? Okay, so I was 4 years old when I came to this church, and that would be over 50 years ago. And you know, I think of this church fondly. When my mom brought me here, I was somewhere in this Sunday school wing here. And I don't have a lot of memories, but what I do remember are the basalite block walls, which have not changed, and a really warm feeling that I got here. And so, you know, a few years later, we ended up going to another church as a family, but this is where I got my start on a spiritual path, so I'm super grateful. All right, switching to reading glasses. I'd like to start with a favorite scripture, Psalm 23, but before we do, just wanted to let you all know, you know, before the pandemic, this is basically how I work, pretty much full-time now, and teaching teachers in this format for 13 years. So, so here's some students of mine. They're all learning to be teachers, teaching English as a second language, and we actually do have a lot of fun in the class. Here's an example of some of my students. They were demonstrating how to literally use a sock puppet so to learn and teach English. So they asked us in our Zoom classroom, the students that were presenting, everyone take off your socks, put your sock on a hand, and then we proceeded to work on the teaching of pronunciation and fluency with teaching English. So we do have fun in class. So that's a little bit of my work life. but we're going to switch gears a little bit and focus on Psalm 23 just for a moment. And there is a particular phrase that I'm going to really pull out of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still and quiet waters. He refreshes and restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort and they console me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed and refreshed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy and unfailing love shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell forever in the house and in the presence of the Lord. So what I wanted to pull out of this scripture that's so familiar to all of us is that, David was the author. King David was the author of this psalm, as we know. And, David made a lot of mistakes in his life, didn't he? Really big ones, actually. He failed God. He failed himself and those he loved and the people who he was king over. He made so many poor choices, but yet he has a perspective of gratitude, and it really comes out, I think, in this scripture. The gratitude, the love, and abiding with God, no matter anything, really, no matter how he messed up, and we all know he messed up pretty bad. So his position of an open heart and his position of an open mind, and that he had open eyes to see and feel that cup that overflows. And so that's my favorite little piece, I think, in this scripture is that overflowing cup. So an overflowing cup is really symbolic of our lives and the physical provision, the emotional provision, but also spiritual provision that God gives us if we have eyes to see and we open our eyes. And David recognizes that overflowing cup. So, slide before. So that overflowing cup, David had a special, seeing and knowing about this. But what about us? Do we have that? Do we have the seeing and the knowing? Do we see this overflowing? Or is it possible we might miss it? Maybe we miss it because we're not in a good place to recognize these things. Our eyes may not be open to seeing and knowing. So, how does this happen? We can be so overspent, stressed out, too busy, that our eyes are not open, and we are not feeling that cup that overflows. So we actually have a part in this. I mean, God always does his part, so we need to do our part. And so what is our part in this? How can we position ourselves like David to have that openness, that open heart and open eyes? So God, like I said, God always does his part. So we need to engage in our part. So how do we do this? How do we meet God halfway? So we can recognize, first of all, that God gives us agency. He gives us free will to choose. And because of this, we can choose our perspectives. We can choose our attitudes. Not always easy. We can engage in active self-awareness. We can examine ourselves. That's not fun, is it? Self-examination. What is our part? We can interrogate what does not serve us any longer. We can let go of old patterns and old ways of thinking. So first things first, there's the oxygen mask. So maybe you've seen or heard this analogy before about the oxygen mask. So how do we open our eyes and to see and to know? Well, first we have to take care of ourselves. So, here's a little test for all of you. And I'm going to have you complete this sentence, the last two words. All right? That's your heads up. So when you're on an airplane and before the airplane takes off, the flight attendant always says this: should the cabin lose pressure, oxygen mask will drop from the overhead area. Please place the mask over your own mouth and nose before... Yay, okay. Helping others, assisting others, exactly. So, there's an everyday application to this. So in the case of the airplane, oxygen masks are deployed in situations where the oxygen level dropped dangerously low. Without our oxygen mask, we will quickly lose consciousness. Well, we can't help others if we lose consciousness, can we? So really, that's the point here. Our first priority is ourselves, taking care of ourselves. And we might think about this in terms of self-care. We kind of hear a lot about self-care these days. So we are actually going to kind of turn our attention to something called boundaries, and that's really the main focus of the teaching today. And so there's a book that I discovered, and this author, Bill Gautier, in his book, he defines boundaries very specifically, and I wanted to report how this author describes having boundaries in your life. So, learning about boundaries can help us with putting the oxygen mask on ourselves first. So in his book, Your Best Life in Jesus' Yoke, Rhythms of Grace to De-Stress and Live Empowered, he defines boundaries in this way. Personal boundaries are what define your identity. This is me, what I value, am good at, believe in, what I need, what I feel, and that over there is not me. The better your self-awareness of who you are, the greater your capacity to offer compassion and love to others. Good boundaries help you to care for others because you have a stable foundation to operate from and are not distracted or depleted. Self-care first. So put the oxygen mask on yourself first. So why this topic now? Well, it has a lot of relevancy for the times. So why boundaries? Well, we're in this pandemic crisis, as we all know. And there's something called burnout. There's something called compassion fatigue. I don't know if anyone's heard that term before. Compassion fatigue is actually from the social science research literature. And there's a lot of that's being focused on around compassion fatigue because there are a lot of people in professional roles that are really struggling with this right now. So one of my students doing a dissertation and she's actually in the field of social work. She focused on compassion fatigue, and I learned a lot from her. But essentially, compassion fatigue and burnout can affect people in the medical profession, teachers, pastors, counselors, social workers, parents, and maybe even grandparents. So, there's this kind of ripple effect from what we've been living in the last couple of years, a real ripple effect. And so if you take a look at current news right now, there's news reports out there talking about, frontline workers. And one of those groups of frontline workers that are near and dear to my heart are teachers. come from a teaching background, and I work with a lot of teachers. And so I just recently read that K-12 workers are the most burned out employees in America. And it's a sign that the teacher shortage is about to intensify. And we've been hearing about this teacher shortage. A ton of teachers in Napa Valley Unified just retired. And so, you know, there's definitely, it's true here in our own community. So on June 15th, 2022, in Fortune magazine, they reported that K-12 workers are the most burned out. As reported by a Gallup poll of 20,000 full-time U.S. employees, more than 44% of K-12 employees feel always or very often burned out. Teachers are suffering the most in this cohort, with more than half, 52%, reporting burnout. So these findings are indicative of the chronic stress that has plagued teachers since the pandemic began, contributing to the widespread teacher shortage. They've had to teach children how to read over Zoom, which I'm not sure how possible that is, but they did work on that and try. They helped teens with deteriorating mental health. They had to navigate changing COVID-19 protocols. All along the way, they've been asked to sacrifice their life, their health, as they work through the height of the pandemic, and not to mention school shootings. So it's really real out there that these frontline workers are in need of some help. And so I'm going to ask us to turn to a frontline worker that you might not typically think of as a frontline worker. But what we're going to do is we're going to turn to thinking about Jesus and some of his words, because he actually was a frontline worker. Think about it. People followed him all the time. What were they wanting from him? They were wanting to learn. They wanted care. They wanted healing. He was surrounded by people all the time. So he was always facing others' demands, just like, you know, the other professions that we mentioned earlier. So in Luke 5:15, it describes how Jesus would withdraw from the crowds and who wanted him, and they constantly did. He wanted one-on-one time with God, and he would go and get that when he needed it. Jesus also faced a lot of disrespect, hate, from the religious leaders at that time. In Matthew 22, it reports how religious leaders asked him baiting questions to make him look foolish. He also faced the king at that time, who was Herod, who mocked him and said, "Show us a sign that you are the Son of God." And Herod's soldiers taunted and jeered him, and that's from Luke 23. And then one of his own, Peter. Peter was a manipulator. His friend Peter. Jesus had to say no to Peter and the disciples who had an inappropriate agenda for Jesus. They all thought he should be a powerful king. They all thought that he should be a military warrior. But he had to remind Peter and his disciples that, you know, get out of my way, Peter. You have no idea how God works. And he said that in Matthew 16:23. All right, Jesus faces more challenges as a frontline worker. Exploitation. This is where Jesus noticed that the temple was being used for other purposes. And so Jesus cleared out the temple, cleared out the vendors and the money changers who were taking advantage of the poor and turning God's house into a marketplace. And that's in Matthew 21:12 through 17. What about others' misplaced priorities? So Jesus met up with, he's called the rich young ruler. And he told the rich young ruler that he couldn't really help him. And the reason why he couldn't really help him is because money was his main focus, and money was controlling him. And so that would be misplaced priorities. There's many others that Jesus met, and there's references, such in Matthew 5:6, where he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." So don't look to other places. Don't look to wine. Don't look to food. Don't look to all those things that kind of make us feel better in the moment, and including money. So others misplaced priorities. So Jesus also, in one other example, with misplaced priorities, he had to confront the disciples, because this is when the little children in Matthew 19:13 wanted to come up and be taught by Jesus, wanted to sit around Jesus. So Jesus rebuked the disciples who tried to keep the children away from him, and told them that they need to emulate a childlike faith, and we should be like children, actually. So Jesus is our example in knowing, and when he needed to set boundaries, he did. He actually did. So we can look to him as an example. He was a wanted man in his time. So he had to do some things, and here's some examples. In Matthew 6:6, he was an example of personal prayer and meditation time. He said, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. He also says, be honest and direct with people. Don't beat around the bush. Don't try to please them. Really, it's important to have your yes be yes and your no be no. And also in setting priorities, no servant, he said, no servant can serve two masters, like in Luke 16:13. He also said, please God and not people. So that addresses the issue of people pleasing in John 5:44. So this is how Jesus took care of himself. He had his own form of an oxygen mask. He really did set an example for us. So going back to boundaries, kind of thinking about the frontline workers, and, those are the people we really hope, pray for, want them to engage in, learning boundaries and self-care, but it can be for every single one of us, actually, in our lives every day. And so I was on the NAMI website recently, and NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Health, and they have annual conferences, and last year's conference was all online. So I went to the mental health conference from 2021, and I found this really great talk on boundaries. And so this presenter on the NAMI website described boundaries in the form of a metaphor, which is a castle. So imagine a castle, and castles may have really rigid, thick walls, really thick walls, and maybe the drawbridge is up, nobody can get in. And then sort of the opposite of that, if you think about the castle that might have more porous or thin walls, drawbridge would be down. So this could be a metaphor for our lives, and whether we're practicing boundaries, or maybe we even have sort of an extreme, unhealthy boundary where the walls are too thick. We don't let anybody in. Perhaps we're really, really guarded, overly guarded. We don't trust, we don't let anyone in, we overprotect ourselves. We say no to everything and everyone. I know this sounds like an extreme, but that would be the really thick walls when you have those type of boundaries. And then the opposite is where maybe a person that has really thin walls kind of tells all, overshares, maybe over-involved with other people's problems, difficult saying no, having this sort of enmeshment with others, which means not really knowing the line between me and another person. So that line would be blurry. And maybe even accepts disrespect from others or mild abuse. So a healthy place with boundaries would be somewhere in the middle. And it would look different for each of us, actually. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to refer to these two authors that are really well known for their books on boundaries. I think they've written boundaries for just about everybody, boundaries for in marriage and boundaries for teenagers. But their original book, Cloud and Townsend, they discussed that we have these myths about boundaries. And I think one of these I probably believed in for a really long time. But they say that one of the myths is, if I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. Another myth would be, if I set boundaries, I will hurt others. And another one is, if I set boundaries, I'm an angry or harsh person. Well, growing up in the church, that would be me, I think I believed, and I had a misconception about the first one. I really did think if I set boundaries that I'm being selfish. I think I probably believed that and lived that for most of my life. I thought, well, Jesus was the ultimate selfless person, then I should be like that. But as we saw from Jesus' examples, you know, he had really healthy boundaries actually. And so I struggled with this one for a long time. I'm learning a little bit better balance there. But Cloud and Townsend say boundaries are personal property lines that define you, who you are and who you are not, and influence all areas of your life. Boundaries make us less resentful because we can be our authentic selves. So our yes means yes and our no means no. We can be our authentic self. So how do we get to that point of authentic selves? All right, so get to know your inner compass. That's no easy task, but become more aware. Recognize your own needs. What are your own needs, desires? What is your comfort zone? Such needs as quiet personal space, support and comfort, time to pause, respectful interactions, detach from others with love. These are just different ways we can kind of get to know our inner compass a little bit better. And Dr. Brené Brown says, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. All right, you have a little handout in front of you, and I'm going to ask you to take just a minute. I'll stop talking for just a minute. And full disclosure about these questions, we're talking about the Boundary Awareness Survey. I probably struggled with half of these at different points of my life. So just to be really clear that these are real, and I think we can struggle with them, maybe not all of them, but some of them at different points. So go ahead and just, to yourself, you don't have to share at your table, read those statements about boundaries. exhausted. That would be me. And I am recovering from that one. It's taking me time, but I am recovering from that one. So let's go to boundary awareness. So if we struggle with these areas on the little printed page, we're not really able to be our authentic self. Most of us who struggle have no idea, well, what does even authentic self even mean? Tate Adams, let's see, I've read a couple of books on this topic recently, and the author, Tate Adams, she wrote a book, Boundaries in Recovery. I'm going to quote her. She says, "A common thread throughout these reveal that having unhealthy boundaries is closely related to codependency." And author Tate Adams has written this really practical book. It's on boundaries, also on codependency, but she made really clear that codependency does not necessarily mean that you are a person who is married to a person who is an alcoholic. So the definition of codependency is much bigger, much broader than this. She says that codependency is the compelling desire to, quote, help others in order to control situations or people. This control is fear-based and driven by the need for emotional safety. So this is about us, actually. So if we're feeling unsafe or insecure, then we may do some of these things of codependency. And some of these symptoms of codependency, for example, people-pleasing, reactivity, caretaking, kind of overstepping the caretaking role, controlling. And that could be, in the forms of simple things like giving advice or thinking that we know what's best for another person. There's also obsessive thinking or obsession. So these are all what might be considered symptoms of codependency. So she has a lot of interesting things to say about this. I'm going to touch really briefly on the next topic, childhood wounds and trauma. So this could actually be a whole series, so I'm not going to do it justice, but this could be some of why we struggle with boundaries is perhaps in childhood there was wounds that we've never healed from, or perhaps sometime in our life there was some trauma that we haven't healed from. So the author, let me grab this one, Pia Melody is her name. She wrote the book, The Intimacy Factor. And her basic premise in this book is that as children, we develop these coping strategies that help us as the child survive. So if we're in an unhealthy family, and she reflects on her own family upbringing, she was in a home with a single mom. Mom was depressed. Mom left her as a baby, toddler, young child in a crib for many hours a day. So she was neglected. She had abandonment types of issues. So that would just be an example. So when children experience this type of neglect or abuse or whatever it is, that they develop these coping mechanisms. So people-pleasing could be one of them. Be perfect, perfectionism could be one of them. Be silent, don't speak up, don't rock the boat. Caretaking, mood reading, eggshell walking. And then for children to be overly responsible because the adults in the home are not. These are all the different ways children are wounded, and they bring these things into their adult life. So as the child grows, the child takes these coping strategies, not very healthy ones, into adulthood. And what she recognizes, this author in this book, is her own coping strategies were not serving her as an adult. And so she really worked through all of those because they can be pretty detrimental. So we can have difficulties in relationships that stem from some of this, some of the wounds and trauma. So like I mentioned, I'm not really giving this justice, but you certainly can look up the book, and it's on the resources on the bottom of the handout. So next slide. So with childhood wounds and trauma, David Earle, he is actually an author, and he's a business coach out there in the business world. He wrote a book called Love is Not Enough, Changing Dysfunctional Family Habits. He also wrote a book called Wisdom of the 12 Steps, which is on my list next to read. So quoting David Earle, he said, the more severe the dysfunction that you experience growing up, the more difficult boundaries are for you. So where do I start? What's the good news here? Tate Adams has something to say about this. And she has basically some very practical things that we can do. First of all, self-awareness, really important. Start noticing. Start noticing people and activities that energize you, and opposite, those that drain you. Make a list of relationships that have become stressful. See if you can identify when it was that you allowed the boundary to be crossed. So it's our part. When you feel compelled to binge on unhealthy food, alcohol, overspend money, this is an indicator of not wanting to numb your feelings, and I think being aware of that, super important. Try to identify what brought that on. Keeping a journal or a notebook, write about these things. Also keep a gratitude list and write about that as well. So I am in an organization called Al-Anon, and I just wanted to mention here that my Al-Anon sponsor had me keep a journal, and still does, actually, always making notes daily about what I'm grateful for. And that really kind of helps keep my head in the right place. Okay, another place to start. And this is in the book called Paths to Recovery. This is an Al-Anon book from Al-Anon Family Groups. Willingness is a really important concept, willingness. And even if you're not willing in the moment, pray for the willingness to be willing. So this is what is stated in Paths to Recovery. Our willingness to take action for our own recovery, combined with our willingness to let God remove traits that no longer serve us, gives us spiritual muscles to continue our spiritual growth. We are learning to surrender, and as we give up each shortcoming, we experience change in ourselves. We are not alone. We know we can rely on a power greater than ourselves. And that's from Paths to Recovery. Okay, another place to start. So find and use my voice. So the first area to really find and use your voice is in prayer. So praying, God, please wake me up and increase my willingness to uncover the awareness that I need to know about in myself. Please give me eyes to see the areas I need to be more aware of, the areas that don't serve me any longer. And then use my voice with others. So first with God and then with others. This is baby steps. Start with baby steps. Practice with people you can easily trust. And see what happens. They're still going to like you. In fact, they may still love you. And all along, when you're doing this, you're practicing self-care with the oxygen mask. So in your prayer, another aspect that I think is important to acknowledge is that ask God to give you eyes in perhaps to see if you're in denial. So being in denial can serve us pretty well for a while. but it doesn't serve us in the long run. So asking for God to give us eyes to acknowledge and see our own denial. So we have some lived experiences, and looking at our time, I think we're good. I want to introduce to you someone who's going to share from her own experience for a few minutes. And she is my sister here in this church, Lisa Redmond. Come on up, Lisa. And I'll just do a little introduction. She's going to share from her experience, strength, and hope. We are sisters here in this church, but we are also active members in a community called Al-Anon Family Groups. For many years, we both have served in this community and we both have an Al-Anon sponsor. We both have worked through the 12 steps. Real quick, if you don't know what Al-Anon is, quick commercial break here on what it is. Al-Anon is a mutual support community for people whose lives have been affected by someone else's drinking. By sharing common experiences and applying the Al-Anon principles, families and friends who are affected can bring positive changes to their own situation, their own lives, whether the person that drinks continues drinking or not. So the focus is on ourselves. And so I've asked Lisa to come and share with you a little bit from her own experience.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great, great. So I've been coming to this church for many years now, and I've never been on this side of the speaker. So it's kind of fun to be up here and see everybody from this point of view. Like Kim says, we're in Al-Anon together, and boundaries is a big topic in Al-Anon, so I'm here to give you some of my thoughts on boundaries. So I was born into a family that I was groomed for codependency and what I call enmeshment, which is the opposite of setting boundaries. I was born into a family where I had a dad that I was the oldest of 3 brothers, and I had a dad that got married 3 times really quickly, 7 years, 7 years, 7 years, right back to back. So I had a brother from each marriage. And by the time I was 18, there was no mom, and there was 3 brothers and myself. And so I quickly took on this role of, instead of more like being the daughter and the sister, it was more like the wife and the mother. And I learned a behavior of feeling like my responsibility was to take care of these 4 men in my family. And so I sacrificed a lot, and I started feeling like if I could take care of everything they need, if I could guide them, if I could do all of the things, the caretaking, then we could have a nice, healthy family. Well, that wasn't as easy as I thought. So as I got older, I have a brother. One of my brothers is a lifetime drug addict, which is one of the reasons I got into Al-Anon. He's sober now, which is amazing at 52 years old. But there was a lot of chaos, a lot of jail time, in and out of jail, DUIs, hospitalizations, a lot of things that were really difficult. I also had a brother who was sort of estranged from our family for 10 years, and so there was some complications there. And then my third brother had many instances where he's in trouble with the law for different reasons. So I spent a lot of my life trying to fix these things and trying to caregive these things and trying really just to keep everybody okay in our family, and felt like that was my responsibility. The other part of this is I worked in my family business for a while. So not only did I feel like I was responsible for all the personal things as with my family and my brothers, but also the work decisions and the things that were around the business. And so it was just a lot. I have memories of while I was working in my years of working with my dad, is I would go to lunch with him every day. And we'd sit at lunch, and he would tell me all of his problems and all of the things about his life and the business and my brothers and his girlfriends. And he'd walk away from that lunch feeling lighter And I'd walk away from that lunch feeling very heavy because I I internalized those problems and made them my own. And this is what we call enmeshment. One of the things my dad used to tell me is, if you thought of us like a branch and then you broke the branch apart, that we'd just fit right back together and operate as one. And I always think that was a good example about how I felt back then. So I carried this behavior over into my marriage. I got married at 33, and I was married for 15 years, and I had 2 little boys that are now big boys. And I had lots of great memories of my marriage, but one of the bad things was my husband was showing signs of alcoholism. And so I like to say that I watched him turn from a cucumber to a pickle during the time that we were married. And so those same behaviors of caretaking and feeling like that I could make this better if I could just control the amount he drank, or talk him into drinking half as much, or all of the things that I could do as a caretaker. I rolled those patterns right into my marriage and tried to do the same thing with him, which didn't work. So about this time, I found my way into Al-Anon, and I found my way into a group that taught me something different. And I started to study some of the things that Kim's talking about today, codependency, and in particular what we're talking about today, the boundaries part of it. And in the beginning, I felt like I just had this funnel going into my brain, and all of this information, a lot of similar of what we've seen today, was just sort of going into my brain, and I was learning new skills and new ways to be where I could set boundaries and not have such enmeshment with the people around me. And one day I remember it started working, and I started to see that I was handling things different, and I was putting down boundaries, and I was keeping myself happy instead of just feeling like everybody else came before me. And I noticed that the relationships I had started to get better. So I thought I'd give you a couple examples of the boundaries that I put in place back then. One of them was with my brother at the time that was an addict. I made a decision that I was only comfortable meeting him in a place that was not either of our homes for maybe a 2-hour or less period and have a meal together, instead of sort of having us at our homes, and it seemed to lead to more of the problems. The other thing I implemented is with my dad, I started getting together in groups, bringing my boys more when we were together, so we didn't get into those one-on-one conversations where I felt like I was solving all of his problems. So those are just a couple of the boundaries that I put in place. And again, I really started to notice the change in my relationships, which is a happy thing. So I have a couple of readings here about boundaries that Kim picked out. And let's see here. See if I can balance this. Okay. So this book is called Courage to Change, and it's our daily reader in Al-Anon. So this comes from that book. Oh wait, I got to get my glasses on. Okay. Two of those closest to me were newly recovering alcoholics. During the drinking years, I had become so enmeshed with them and their self-destructive behavior that I lost sight of the idea that I could be happy even if they were depressed. I could live a serene life even if they went back to drinking. The turning point in my Al-Anon recovery came when someone told me, "You'll have to learn to make it whether the alcoholic does or not." From that day on, I tried to keep in mind that I had my own life and my own destiny. Once I began to separate my welfare from that of the alcoholics, I found it easier to detach from the decisions they made about how and where and when and with whom to conduct their lives. Because of my fate, my very life was no longer tied directly to theirs. I was able to accept them for who they were and listen to their ideas and concerns without trying to exercise control. Thanks to Al-Anon, I can concentrate my energy where I do have some control over my own life. My time is too precious to waste living in the future or worrying about something over which I have no power. I am building a wonderful life for myself today. One more. Genuine, healthy love isn't self-destructive. It doesn't diminish or strip us of our identities, nor does it in any way diminish those we love. Love is nourishing. It allows us to be more fully ourselves. The enmeshment and characterizes an alcoholic's relationship does just the opposite. These tools have really worked for me. Boundaries have really worked for me. And I'm grateful that I have the program, the Al-Anon program, and the friends that I have in the program to help me stay straight and keep living by some of the things I've learned. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Lisa. I've heard your story, and every time I hear it, it moves my heart, so thank you. So I wanted to end with my own personal story, as Lisa has shared hers. I call it my hardest boundary, and I'm going to just read it because this is something that I've been writing over the last month or so, and I think it captures it pretty well. And then we'll end our service time together. So, my son, at age 18, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. There were many crises and events that led up to the diagnosis, but I will spare you from knowing all those details. Let's fast forward to a point in time where I, as a mother of a boy with bipolar disorder, had to make the most difficult boundary decision of my life. The world's standards may consider what I did was an unloving and heartless act toward my son, but those in a recovery community would see it differently. Recovery from what, you may ask? Recovery from the effects of sleepless nights due to the look of buzzy eyes that might indicate use of unknown substances. Oh wait, or are those buzzy eyes due to a manic episode? I never really knew. Recovery from what became a chaotic family life that was once a joyful place. Recovery from a 30-year marriage that ended in disloyalty and blame. Our therapists we saw at the time said spouses will sometimes seek distraction because the pain of reality is too great. Distraction somehow temporarily eases that pain and blinds one into thinking that the answer to the pain is a new relationship. As for me, however, I had a different form of distraction. I was in fix-it mode, constantly researching, reading to find answers to help my son. Little did I know at that time I was in need of recovery from my own thinking, my own fear, and my own hopelessness. It was 2017 during the blazing fires in Napa County. We know that. We were all there for this. Our lives were smoke-filled and fear-filled. And simultaneously, I knew my son was heading toward a manic episode. I could see all the signs. At that time, he was living in a trailer on his aunt and uncle's property where I visited him. He was under the care of a doctor and prescribed medicines for bipolar disorder. But symptoms were increasing to the point of wondering how I could get my son some help. But I dreaded that he would not go willingly. At that time, in an Al-Anon meeting that I was attending, one of the group members shared about a service in Napa County that I had never known existed. It was a program through Napa County Health and Human Services called County Crisis Stabilization. While we were experiencing a community crisis with Napa on fire, it became more apparent that my son's mental health symptoms were increasing to a possible breaking point. I spoke to my sister-in-law, Jen, who was home that day, and asked her if she would be able to help me get my son in the car and safely bring him to get some help. She had observed his increasing mental health issues and agreed to help. Together, we talked to my son in the front yard, and he was agitated and not able to sit, but I think deep down inside, he knew he needed to get some help. He agreed to getting in the car, but in a moment of fear, he took off into the neighborhood on foot. Jen strategically picked up her small dog, Dixie. She got in the passenger side of my car while we drove the neighborhood looking for my son. We spotted him, pulled over, and as she was trying to convince him to get in the car, I was praying. Somehow, he did get in the back seat with Dixie as we drove him to crisis stabilization. And gratefully, it was a two-door car, so he did not have access to a door handle. I drove, and I continued to pray, and Jen continued to ask my son to pet Dixie to help Dixie feel safe while we proceeded to take the longest short drive of my lifetime. We arrived in the parking lot where a large stature security officer met us to help my son in the building for admittance. I had called in advance to let them know we were coming. My son had difficulty letting go of Dixie, who provided some security. He was checked in, observed, and recommended to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Sacramento, where he stayed for 2 weeks. During this hospital stay, and yes, there were several others previous, my son seemed to respond in humility and willingness to be there and not constantly asking to leave like he had in the past. Here is where he was administered his medicines regularly, receiving counseling, and was set up with a caseworker at Napa County Health and Human Services. For the first time, my son had support beyond his release from the hospital, and for the first time, I did not feel completely alone upon his release. The Sacramento hospital stay ended, but fortunately, the caseworker set up a place for aftercare, which happened to be a home care facility in Napa here, where he would continue on his medicine stabilization. The aftercare home stay lasted 2 to 3 weeks, where medicines were adjusted, administered, sleep was regulated, and little by little my son came back. The person he is in a bipolar manic state is not the person he really is. When he comes back, I'm grateful, and in the same moment, I fear the next time. The caseworker and one of the counselors at the aftercare home provided us with some recommendations for continued mental health support. They did not recommend him to go to my home since medicine compliance and use of other substances had been a struggle for several years. I knew from prior experience that I cannot be the one to hold him accountable for taking his medication. The caseworker let us know that there was availability at Bella House, it was called, in North Napa, which is a residential care home where medicine support and counseling are provided for people with mental illness. Although Bella House was the next level of supportive care, my son refused it. He said, "I'm okay, don't need to go there," he said. The time came after some clear discussions with the counselor and many tears on my part and a confused mother's heart. I realized I had to state a clear boundary that my son is not welcome in my home. Not at this time. One recommendation to me involved finding out more about the local homeless shelter in case that needed to become a viable option. I read the shelter website and I talked to others who knew of their services. The thought of my son at the homeless shelter broke my heart. What kind of mother would do this? A horrible mother, a heartless mother. No, actually, a mother who wants a different outcome for her son. I slowly tried to embrace going against the grain of my heart in the hopes of a different outcome this time. Before I arrived to the group home, I talked to my Al-Anon sponsor, who reassured me it was a boundary that I needed to set to take care of me and to release my son to the care of God. I was very familiar with giving my son to God pretty much every day, every hour, sometimes every minute. But I still remember parking my car and sitting there in dread over what was about to happen. I said, son, the professionals that know your health condition are recommending you go to Bella House to continue to get support with your stability on the medicines. And actually, you have two choices. You can either go to Bella House for continued support, or you can go to the homeless shelter. I checked. They do have space. His face looked as if I had gravely offended him. He yelled at me and then had tears in his eyes. My eyes swelled with tears. My throat closed. I felt nauseous. And the counselor stepped in and said, my son could take some time to make the decision. He could have until the next day. The next day came. I received a call that Bella House still had an opening. And that's where my son did decide to go. He stayed at Bella House for several months, was able to get stable on his medicines. And since that time, 3 years ago, he has slowly made progress. He's been able to hold a full-time job. He worked all through the pandemic. He saved his money, recently rented his own place for the first time. Today, I look at him with so much respect and gratitude for how far he's come. Saying no and having a clear boundary was a lifeline for me, but it also gave my son the opportunity to have healing, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and to become well. He may not reflect the world's image of what a successful man should be, but perhaps he reflects a godly image, which goes much deeper to the spectrum of challenges he's had to face, wrestle with, fail, get back up again, fail, get back up again. So God, thank you for giving me this son who has brought me to my knees. Time and time again. I will praise you in the storm, for the pain and hardship has been a pathway to peace. I will continue to seek you, rely on you, and trust you always. So that's my hardest boundary story. And what I learned, and what I can say is a real gift for me today, is up on the slide. The mother and child relationship is a very strong bond of protection and care. However, in some cases, protection and care can be detrimental. Saying no was actually critical, and now I can look back and I can see that clearly. But at the time, I didn't really know for sure. So I'm going to kind of take my son out of this part and just refer to the other person, since some of you may identify with some of these things. So I need to change me, not the other person. How can I respond differently and make different choices? How can I take care of myself in this situation? I need to give the other person the dignity of their own experience, without my influence and without my control. The other person needs to feel their own consequences to their choices, without me softening that experience. And how did I find the strength to get through these times? Well, of course, my faith in the all-loving God and the support from the Al-Anon community, from my sponsor. It took a literal village, I think, to get me to where I am right now. So that's all I have for you today. I want to close. We actually kind of have two prayers to close with. We have the Serenity Prayer, and this is a version of the Serenity Prayer, and this was actually written in 1933. This is a little bit longer version than the one we hear more typically. And this was written by Reinhold Niebuhr, and he was an American theologian and university professor. He wrote, God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which could be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely joyful with you forever in the next. Amen. Would you all join me in the Lord's Prayer? We'll close out our service. Our Father, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you all. It was a privilege to be here. Have a wonderful day. Are we done, Dar? Okay.